Welcome again to our show. I'm Harry Greenberger. I'm president of the New Orleans Secular Humanist Association, and I'm the host for this program. Today we have two guests with us. One of them is Lanny Goldfinch, who is a member of the board of directors of our organization, and we have as a special guest the Reverend Jim Vanderweel, who is with the Community Unitarian Universalist Church here in New Orleans. Roughly, I don't know exactly what these folks are going to say, but roughly our topic is the history of scholarship about Jesus. And before I ask either of them to, start our program, along that line, I had picked up a little comment written, it was under the title, The Historical Christ by Rick Wade, and I think this is important. He says, the question of the historical reliability of the Gospels is critical because Christianity rests upon its historical events. If the possibility of having true knowledge of these is gone, we have nothing upon which to base our beliefs. Without the historical events, Christianity becomes just another set of beliefs. Now, that's my contribution to the topic. Either one of you who wants to start there, go ahead.
Let me begin by saying that I definitely do not speak for all the New Orleans secular humanists. In fact, I don't even most of the time speak for myself. So I'm going to give you an overview, very quick overview of the topic. What Harry just shared with you is one minor point of view about this issue. That is the question that if these events aren't historically true, then Christianity rests on nothing, which is sort of part of what one faction believes. But in the last however number of years, there's been over 100,000 books written about Jesus. 100,000. Half of those written in the last 50 years since Vatican II loosened the reins on Catholic scholars and invited them in to come and share their expertise. Well, to tell you the truth, I may have read over my lifetime 100 of these books, so that's 1/10 of 1%. So I'm definitely not an expert or a scholar in this field. In fact, I don't read like a scholar does, take notes, and so sometimes I may quote one person and it came from somewhere else. I'm not that particularly concerned. So you're on your own when it comes to believing or not believing what I say. But let me put it this way. There are four different general traditions, attitudes towards looking at Jesus as an individual, as a person. The first I'm going to not talk about today at all is what I would call the eccentric view or the kook view. These are the ones that believe that Jesus lived on mushrooms or blah, 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 blah. Did stuff that there's no evidence for anywhere except in their own brains. They come up with these kooky ideas. So I'm not going to talk about those. But of the more serious views, and I use that in quotes, there are three factions. What I will call the realistic view, what I will call the historical view, and what I will call the fictional view. The realistic view is the one that those of you who went to Sunday school probably got growing up in Sunday school. The Bible is true. The stories are valid, historically valid. Jesus did this, Jesus did that. They would go to the New Testament and read these events. Now, the fact that there's contradictions in those events gives them a problem, but they usually work their way around it or don't even deal with it. About 150, a little more than that, years ago, a man named David Strauss, a German, started the quest for the historical Jesus. And if you read any book in this field, I would suggest Albert Schweitzer's book, The Quest for the Historical Jesus, that reviews those early scholarly critiques of the traditional literal view. They started by noticing things that anybody that carefully reads the Bible as opposed to devotionally reading the Bible will notice. For example, Christmas is coming up. There's the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Mark deal with the birth of Jesus. They're completely different. If you read them side by side, you'll find that they're two different. One of them has wise men coming, the other one has shepherds coming. One of them happens at this time. The stories don't jive at all. So they start developing explanations of this, the historians, historical approach. Or you can look at, the one that I like is if you look at one passage that's in all four of the Gospels, aside from the death of Jesus, is when Jesus goes into the temple and cleans it out, when he runs all the money changes and so forth out of the temple. A very famous passage. Each version is slightly different, depending on how old the book is. One version, Jesus goes in with whips and gets everybody out with a big whip. Another version, you go in and he's quoting Scripture, and he's damning them with Old Testament Scripture. Another verse, he goes in, and apparently just with the sweetness of his voice, he drives them out.
But the fact is that none of this was being recorded contemporaneously with the event.
Very good point.
These are just the writings, like a generation later.
Right.
But what is the third one? You got
okay,
to the third one.
Okay.
What's the third one? Let's go on to the third one.
Okay, the third one essentially is the one that I find the most interesting. In essence, in short, it notices that the earliest books in the New Testament are written by St. Paul. Okay? Corinthians, the letters of St. Paul. These were written probably 40 years before any of the Gospels came out. St. Paul doesn't mention anything about Jesus as a historical person. Doesn't mention Pilate, doesn't mention his birth, doesn't mention his miracles, doesn't mention any traveling that he did, anything that he said. The only thing that mattered to St. Paul was that Jesus was a spiritual creature, a divine spiritual creature that somehow died and came back from the dead, just like Dionysius did, and just like a lot of the hero gods of the Greeks. He did the same kind of thing. This is 40 years before Christianity wrote the first Gospels. The first Gospels were written around 70 A.D., Mark, which is probably the earliest, about the time that the temple was destroyed.
Yes.
The Jews pissed the Romans off something terribly. They came in with a massive army, pulled all their troops out of England, Britain at the time, to destroy everything over there. They burned Jerusalem down. No Jew was allowed to live within the shadow of Jerusalem after 70 A.D. at that point. And that's when the Gospels started being written, each one in a different community, each one for a different audience. Mark was the earliest. Mark apparently never even visited Palestine because he's confused about his directions. He didn't have Google to map to find out Jesus was to go this way, but the town he actually was going to was the other direction. That kind of thing.
Okay.
What does all of this, what you're telling, what does this tell us? Because there are really, in my mind, two questions. First question, was there ever a historical Jesus? Did such a person ever exist? The other one is, if he did the things attributed to him actually take place? So I see that we should be looking at two different questions.
Right.
Jim?
Go ahead.
First of all, I would say that I am also not an expert. I did attend seminary and graduated from seminary, and so I'm very familiar with the fact that Mark was the first book of the Bible written, and it was about 70 that it was written. But there are two things that concern me and why I decided to accept this invitation. The first thing is that Jesus in his ministry basically was telling people, look, you have an established view being presented to you by the Pharisees. Or over here you have an established view being presented to you by the Sadducees. And basically the population as a whole were listening to either the Pharisees or the Sadducees or the Essenes, or another group, and they were following along a pathway of education that had established certain rituals, certain practices, certain presentations. And it kind of bothers me that today so many people are so accepting of the traditions in which they are raised and don't pay attention to the fact that Jesus was really telling the people of his time, develop your own spiritual life, develop your own inner sensitivity, be in touch with God. When he says pray, and pray privately, pray in your closet, not out on the street, showing off for people. Do your own individual spiritual work. And that was Jesus' presentation. But the other thing that interests me is I've been most involved with the historical approach. And I've looked at it from the historical standpoint. And in the early time of the church, we had the Roman Empire establishing 3 different capitals. One in Rome, one in Constantinople, and one in Alexandria. And at that time, those who were involved in that whole planning pulled in the religious people of the time, and they decided to become Christian. And they established Christianity as a state religion.
That was 300 years before that.
It was 300 years before that happened.
Okay.